Picture this. A cold morning in the interior of British Columbia, 1931. The roads into the mountains have been washed out by 3 days of rain, and a small woman in a government issue coat is standing at the edge of a mudslide, looking at what used to be a path. She has walked 14 miles to reach this point. She has 14 more to go. The people she is walking toward have not seen a nurse in 11 months. There is a child with a fever that has lasted 2 weeks. There is a man whose hand was crushed in a logging accident and never set properly. There is an old woman who has been praying someone would come, not because she said so, but because that is what old women in those mountains do when hope runs thin. The nurse at the edge of the mudslide looks down at the drop, looks at her pack, looks at the other side. Then she steps forward. Her name was Eunice Margaret Duff. And before she was done, she would walk more than 100,000 miles through the mountains and valleys of the BC interior, on foot, on horseback, and in a Model T that broke down so often, she learned to rebuild the engine herself, reaching people that the rest of the country had simply decided were too far away to matter. The question her life asks you today is not whether you would have done what she did. The question is whether you have ever met someone so quietly sure of where they were going that it rearranged something in you just to watch them walk. Comment below with "I am willing to go where others won't." If something in you already knows you were built for more than comfort, stay with us until the very end of this story, where we will show you the discipline that kept Eunice going through 41 years of service without a single year of giving up. Before God uses someone fully, He first lets them discover what they are made of in private. The year is 1889. Eunice is born in a small Presbyterian farmhouse outside of Guelph, Ontario, the third of 6 children, in a family that had very little money and a great deal of conviction. Her father was a quiet man who read the Bible every morning before the farm work began, not because anyone was watching, but because he said it was the only way he knew how to start a day right. Her mother was sharper, faster, the kind of woman who organized the church relief drive and ran the household accounts and still found time to teach Eunice and her sisters to read before they were 5. The family was not remarkable by any outward measure. They did not travel. They did not have connections. They were simply people who believed that the world had needs in it, and that you were responsible for the needs you could reach. Eunice grew up understanding this the way she understood the seasons, not as an idea but as a fact of life. What most accounts of Eunice Duff leave out, and it matters a great deal, is that she was not naturally selfless, not as a girl. She was the one who argued with her sisters over the last piece of bread. She was the one who wanted to study music in Toronto and was furious for 3 full months when her family could not afford to send her. She cried about it in a way she later described as shameful, because she could see even then that the want was real, but the proportion was wrong. She wanted things for herself. She wanted recognition. She wanted to be somewhere that felt important. And she felt a constant low guilt about wanting it. Can you recognize that? That particular tension between who you are and who you sense you are supposed to be. At 16, a visiting missionary came to speak at their church, a woman who had spent 12 years working in the logging camps of northern Ontario, patching up injuries with whatever she had, delivering babies in the back of wagons, sitting with men who were dying and didn't want to die alone. She was not dramatic about it. She just described it plainly, the way you describe what you had for breakfast. And something in Eunice went very quiet. She went home that night and did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the music school in Toronto. She thought about the woman's face when she talked about the logging camps. How it had no performance in it, how it just looked like someone who had found the place where their life fit. She thought about her father reading before dawn, not because anyone was watching. She did not make a decision that night. But something planted itself. At 22, she entered nursing training at Toronto General Hospital. It was grueling in the way that training was grueling then, which is to say it asked everything and explained very little and expected you to keep pace regardless. She was good at it, precise, calm under pressure, able to make decisions quickly without flinching. Her supervisors noted she had a gift for patients who were frightened. She did not talk them out of their fear. She simply sat with it alongside them until it settled. She graduated in 1914, the same year the war began. She could have gone overseas. Many of her classmates did. She applied and was accepted and had her papers in her hand when she read a posting in a nursing journal about a provincial outreach program that was attempting to bring medical care to isolated communities in the sea interior. Communities that had no hospital, no doctor, no nurse, and in many cases no road. She put the overseas papers down, picked up a different set of forms, and wrote a letter to British Columbia that changed everything. She arrived in the Okanagan in the autumn of 1914 with a medical bag, a horse she had never ridden before, and a list of 17 communities she was responsible for. The list covered more ground than some European countries. The first winter nearly broke her, not because of the physical hardship, though the physical hardship was real. Temperatures she had no frame of reference for, trails that vanished under snow, cabines so remote she sometimes traveled 3 days to reach them. No. What nearly broke her was the loneliness. She had not expected the silence. She had grown up in a household of 6 children, trained in a hospital full of people, and now she was riding for hours through mountains that did not care whether she was there or not. There were days when she did not speak to another human being. There were nights when she sat in a small rented room in whatever settlement would have her and wrote letters home that she tried to make sound less bleak than they were. Her mother wrote back every week without fail. The letters arrived in batches, 2 or 3 at once. When the post finally got through, her mother wrote about the farm and the church and her sisters and small ordinary things, and at the end of every letter, the same line, the same handwriting, slightly uneven because her mother's hands were beginning to stiffen with age. The Lord knows where you are. He has always known where you are. Eunice kept those letters. She kept all of them. When she was very old and someone asked her what had sustained her through the hard years, she said, without hesitating, the letters from home and the certainty underneath them. The second year was different. Not easier, but different. She had learned the land. She had learned the rhythms of the communities she served, who to ask for directions, and who gave directions that would get you killed, which families needed her to come inside and sit down before she did anything medical, which ones needed her to be fast and efficient and not take too much of their time. She had learned which trails were passable in which seasons and when the river crossings were safe. And the people had learned her. There is a particular kind of trust that builds between a community and a nurse who shows up in January on horseback in the dark because someone sent word that a child was sick. It does not build quickly. It does not build from announcements. It builds from showing up, repeatedly, without complaint, and then showing up again. By 1918, when the influenza pandemic swept through the interior with a ferocity that stunned even the people who had survived hard winters, Eunice was the only medical presence across 5,000 square kilometers. She barely slept for 6 weeks. She moved from cabin to cabin, farm to farm, indigenous settlement to lumber camp, doing what she could and sitting with people when there was nothing more to do. She held the hands of people who were dying. She sent for help that often arrived too late, and sometimes not at all. She contracted the influenza herself in November. She had been warned it was coming for 3 weeks and refused to slow down. She collapsed in the doorway of a family she had just finished treating and was carried inside by the man of the house, who said afterward he had not believed a person could weigh so little and still be working. She spent 10 days in bed. On the 11th day she got up. There was still work. She never spoke about that period with sentiment. When she wrote about it in her journal, which was discovered after her death, she was matter-of-fact to the point of bluntness. Lost 3 in the valley above Clearwater. Could not reach the Henderson place in time. What is required of me is simply to go back. That is not the language of performance. That is the language of someone who has settled something deeply and privately and moved on. In 1922, the provincial program she had worked under for 8 years had its funding cut. She was told her position no longer existed. She was 33 years old and had no income and no immediate prospects, and had spent 8 years becoming an expert in a specific kind of care for a specific place. She had choices. She could return to Toronto. Her reputation was good enough by then that any hospital would have taken her. She had a colleague who had opened a nursing practice in Vancouver and was pressing her to come and join it. She had family who wanted her closer. She looked at the map of the interior on the wall of the small office she was clearing out. She looked at the 17 communities she had been responsible for. She thought about the child she had visited in the winter, whose parents had not seen a nurse in 8 months before she arrived. She folded up the map and put it in her bag. She went back to church mission service. Different organization, same charity, lower pay, more freedom. She wrote one line in her journal the night she signed the new papers. I belong to this land now. Might as well stay. It was not poetry. It was just true. The 1920s and 1930s brought her deeper into the interior and into relationships she had not foreseen. She began working more extensively with indigenous communities along the Fraser River and into the Caribou. Communities that had been decimated by disease and displacement and government policy, that had learned to be cautious of outsiders who arrived with intentions and left with conclusions. Eunice did not arrive with intentions. She arrived with a medical bag. She also arrived willing to be told she was wrong. This was rarer than it should have been. There was an elder in one community, a woman named only in Eunice's journal as Beatrice of the River, who told her plainly in their first meeting that she was welcome to treat the sick, but that she should understand she was a guest in a place that had its own knowledge and its own history, and if she forgot that she would not be welcomed a second time. Eunice wrote that she went home that evening and thought about it for a long time. She wrote, "She is right. I would do well to remember. I am a student here as much as anything else." She went back. She went back for 20 more years. The trust that eventually built was slow and real, and nothing like what a report would call it. She never talked about this work in terms of what she gave. In the rare interviews she gave in later life, she consistently described what she had received, the things she had learned about plants and seasons, and the particular quality of silence in a forest from people who had lived in that silence for generations. She said she arrived thinking she was bringing something and discovered she was being handed something she had not known to ask for. This is harder to quantify than a statistic, but it matters. In 1929, she acquired the Model T. The roads in the interior were improving, slowly and unevenly, and a car could reach places in hours that had taken her days on horseback. The car broke down constantly. She taught herself to fix it from a manual and from a mechanic in Williams Lake named Percival, who had the patience of someone who has explained things many times and knows that the explaining is part of the work. She drove that car through conditions it was not designed for, through mud that swallowed the axles, through winter ice that required her to tie chains around the tires and pray they held, through mountain passes that she described in her journal as having a particular quality of terrifying beauty, which is a phrase that tells you something about who she was. She was not reckless. She had simply decided that the distance between her and the people who needed her was a problem to be solved, and she was going to solve it with whatever she had. In 1934, she delivered a baby in the back of the Model T in a snowstorm 10 miles outside of Quesnel. The mother had gone into labor early. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away in good conditions, and there were no good conditions. Eunice pulled over on the side of the road and did what needed to be done. The baby was healthy. The mother recovered. They named the girl Eunice. There was a second Eunice in the Caribou for several decades after that. Eunice, the nurse, considered this the finest thing that had ever happened to her. What she taught was difficult to name but impossible to miss if you saw it. She taught by doing. She moved through the world with a precision and a patience that were not separate things. They were the same thing expressed in different moments. When she was with a patient, she was completely with that patient. There was no part of her that was somewhere else. This quality of presence was so uncommon that people remarked on it, not knowing quite how to describe it, except to say that she made you feel you were the only thing that mattered to her in that moment. She was not performing this. She had simply, at some point early in her career in the mountains, understood that the people she was serving had no margin for her to be distracted. They lived too far from any backup. When she was there, she was their only option. That knowledge had made her more attentive than she might otherwise have been, and the attentiveness had become, over years, the kind of presence that people describe as a gift but is really a discipline that has been practiced until it looks like grace. She had her own disciplines. She read her Bible every morning before anything else, a habit she had learned watching her father and had kept so long it was simply who she was. She wrote in her journal most nights, even when exhausted, even when she had nothing but a single line of observation or a name. She walked when she could, not as exercise, but because she found that the mountains worked something out of her on her behalf, that the physical motion of walking through landscape was a kind of prayer she could not have explained to anyone who had not tried it. She did not talk about her faith constantly. She mentioned it when it was relevant. She lived it in a way that was visible without being announced. By the 1940s, her name was known far beyond the interior. Articles had been written. A radio program had profiled her. The provincial government had given her a commendation. She attended the ceremony in Victoria in her best coat and shook hands with the right people and returned to the Caribou on the next available transportation, because there was a family near likely she needed to check on. She was embarrassed by attention, not falsely modest, genuinely embarrassed, the way a person is embarrassed when someone praises them for something they cannot imagine not doing. In one of the late interviews she gave, a journalist described her as heroic, and she looked at him with an expression he later described as somewhere between puzzled and impatient. She said, "I am a nurse. I went where the patients were. That is what nurses do." She retired in 1955. She was 66 years old. She moved to a small house in Kamloops near her youngest sister's family, and she spent the first several months doing very little, which her body appeared to require, and her mind resisted. She read. She wrote letters. She went to church every Sunday. She had a garden that she tended with the same precision she had brought to everything else. People still came to her for advice. Not medical advice, though sometimes that too. People who were afraid of something, or who were stuck, or who had a decision in front of them that they could not see around. She had the quality of someone who had made so many decisions in impossible conditions that she could look at a problem another person found paralyzing and see it clearly without making the other person feel foolish. She did not tell people what to do. She asked questions, long, patient, unhurried questions that had the effect of helping people find what they already knew. In her final years, when she moved more slowly and the garden became smaller, she spent more time reading and writing and less time outside. Her journals from that period are different in tone from the earlier ones. The earlier journals are operational. Names, dates, treatments, outcomes. The later ones are more reflective. She wrote about what she had learned, about what she wished she had understood sooner, about the people she had known and what they had given her. She wrote about faith with a directness that her journals from the working years mostly didn't have, not because she had believed less then, but because she had been too busy to describe it. In the later journals, she had time. She wrote about what it meant to her to believe that the God who she understood to be the creator of the mountains she had driven and walked through for 41 years was also present in the rooms where people were frightened and sick. She wrote that this was not a theory for her. It was something she had tested 10,000 times in conditions that did not allow for wishful thinking, and it had held. She wrote, "The presence I have known in the worst moments was not comfort exactly. It was more like company. The kind of company that does not need to say anything, the kind that simply stays." She died on a Tuesday morning in February 1961. She was 72 years old. She had lived long enough to see the communities she had served begin to have hospitals and roads, and in some cases, their own doctors. She had lived long enough to understand that her particular kind of work was becoming less necessary, which she considered a success. At her funeral in Kamloops, the church could not hold everyone who came. People had driven from Quesnel and Williams Lake and the Okanagan Valley and communities further than that. Some of them were the children of people she had treated. Some of them were people she had treated themselves. A few were very old. One man stood at the back of the church and did not go through the receiving line. He was in his early 30s, which meant he had been born when Eunice was still working. Afterward, someone asked him how he knew her. He said she had delivered him in the back of a car in a snowstorm, and that he had been told this story his whole life. And he had felt that this was someone he owed something to, though he could never figure out exactly what. He drove 300 miles to stand at the back of a church for an hour. That is one way of saying what someone meant to you. Her book of prayer methods, which she had written not for publication but as a guide for the nurses who came after her to the same territory, was eventually printed by a small religious press in 1963. It went through 4 editions. It is still in print. The nurses who use it today mostly don't know who she was. They just know that whoever wrote it had clearly been in the places she was describing, and that the advice was honest, and that the faith underneath it was not decoration but structure, the thing the whole approach was built on. The woman who walked 14 miles in the rain and then looked at a mudslide and stepped forward, anyway, did not leave behind a monument. She left behind a way of moving through hard places that other people could pick up and carry. Her last journal entry, written 3 days before she died, is a single line, not a conclusion, not a summary. Just an observation, the kind she had been making for 50 years, simple and exact and more than enough. The mountains are very beautiful this morning. I think I will be glad to have known them.